So a whole bunch of people have been consistently calling for us to ban multiple Quiver Dance Pokemon in the tier. And today I want to talk about them. We've got a really wide array of different Pokemon that can use Quiver Dance, and I want to go through the ones that get consistently called for bans, the ones that maybe down the line people will start calling for bans for, and then the ones that, it's too hard to say right now. And let's start off with the ones that are getting the most talk. I think it's pretty easy to see which ones those would be. But we're going to first start off with Oricorio Pom Pom. Now, Pom Pom is probably the best Pokemon in the tier. If not, it's number 2 or 3 behind Passimian and Goodra. And the biggest reason for that is it's incredible defensively. So, Electric Flying, we all know that as Zapdos' defensive typing, and it's allowed it to have an incredible niche in higher tiers throughout its entire existence. And so naturally, that still translates really well to Oricorio Pom Pom, as it's a Pokemon that's capable of taking advantage of foes like Passimian, like Sandaconda, even some of the other fighting types if they choose to lock into a fighting type move. And that makes it really easy to find turns to set up Quiver Dance with. Now, the main thing that I would say breaks this Pokemon is Terra Sterilization, especially with Terra Ground, because what this does is it denies a whole bunch of the common revenge killers from being able to do that now. In specific, Lycanroc, that's like the big one here, because you gain the resistance to rock. It can no longer pick you off with a Cellurock. And it also makes it so Pokemon like Caparaja can no longer safely switch in and Whirlwind you out, makes it so something like Curse Muck isn't as consistent, even maybe like a Terra Poison Goodra that could otherwise, tank a hit and then phase you with Dragon Tail, that becomes a little bit less of a consistent answer to you. And then, of course, next is Venomoth. Now, the main thing about Venomoth is Tinted Lens is just an incredible ability, especially when you factor in Sleep Powder, because there are a couple Pokemon that maybe could otherwise deal with Venomoth. You're looking at, again, certain Curse Muck, looking at Chansey, you're looking at even some of the Oricorios if they get a 50-50 correct and they come in as you Quiver Dance and they copy your boost. However, the main issue comes from Tinted Lids just negating so much of your defensive counterplay. Naturally, when you don't have anything that resists Bug Buzz, it becomes an insanely spammable attack. And it's really only contendable with some of those special walls we just talked about. You're relying on a not too large swath of Pokemon that still can take a boosted hit, even maybe if it's at +2, but they still have to play around a Sleep Powder. They still have to even maybe play around you having Substitute and forcing moves to miss, looking at Jugudra, or having Sludge Bomb and being able to just look for a crippling status affliction earlier in the game, only to come back later on and finally decide, okay, I'm ready to set up now and sweep your team. And next is Frosmoth. Now, we've talked about Frosmoth a lot in our videos on this channel. And a big thing about Frosmoth is the very small amount of steel types in the tier. Something that I do think is a valid criticism of some of these Terra-reliant Pokemon is, hey, you force your opponent to Terra with them sometimes. You can use that to your advantage later on in a game. Think about how Dynamax in Generation 8 random battles works, where you could potentially have your opponent Dynamax earlier. If you don't get beat then, you've just made your opponent use an incredibly powerful tool that they can't get back. Now you have the element of surprise later on. And Frostmoth definitely falls under that. Because naturally, okay, if I run into a Caparaja or any other steel type like Berserker, or just something that uses Terra Stylization and turns into a steel type itself, it might then turn into a really good check that way. The main issue is we just have such few steel types, and the ones that Terra into steel, those Pokemon aren't very plentiful either, and a lot of them don't even threaten Frostmoth. So oftentimes in games, it doesn't even have to Terra for the coverage of Terra Blast. At worst, what it might be looking to do is Terra into a ground type to gain that resistance to Lycanroc's Cellurock, for example. And gain that defensive advantage over an otherwise great revenge killer. And it's that combination of low steel types and low amount of good revenge killers that really does push Frosmoth over the edge for me. I've always felt like you have to build with a steel type if you want to contend with Frosmoth. And even then, it ends up feeling like a fool's errand because Frosmoth is just gonna Terra is gonna kill you with a Terra Blast. So that's not, that's not too good. And again, we come back to say the Venomoth point of how there are a decent amount of potential special walls that just are so bulky that Frosmoth isn't going to be able to consistently get by them itself, but that pool of Pokemon is really low. And it makes building just feel really, really bad because you're just so limited in the amount of Pokemon that you can realistically put onto a team and have a good time with. And then last of the really good ones, I want to talk about Oricorio Sensu. This is one that people are still a little unsure of because of how good Oricorio Pom Pom has been. Naturally, you can't use both of them on the same team, and so because Pom Pom has a very, very, very good utility set, in addition to a better defensive typing for finding good setup chances, Sensu's a bit to the side. People don't really use it a whole bunch unless they just want to use Oricorio Sensu. But we have seen a lot of people still say that on paper, it's probably still just as broken. Because at the end of the day, Ghost Flying is still really solid coverage. You could Terra into a fighting type or even a fairy type. Of course, the former gives you that Accelerock resistance as well as a super effective attack for both of Chansey and Umbreon, whereas the latter just gives you a fighting resistance, so if you Terra, you don't lose that, while still giving you, say, a super effective move for Umbreon, as well as any other Dark type that may try and Revenge Kill you. And then we can move on to the maybe Ban Quiver Dance ones. And these are Pokemon that don't see a lot of use right now, but seem pretty obvious to just step into the role of main Quiver Dance abuser if the better ones get banned. So, of course, we have Vivillon as our first one. And Vivillon, everyone remembers it from Generations 6 and 7 Inu as that really annoying lead set where it has a Focus Sash, your opponent just always leads with it because, oh, you can't OHKO me, I've got my Focus Sash, and I have Compound Eyes, so I have a super accurate Sleep Powder, and compared to the other Quiver Dance users, I have a really, really strong stab move that I can always fall back onto. And because how Compound Eyes makes Hurricane only have around a 10% chance to miss, going for Terra Flying is actually really good with Vivillon, because what it does is it gives you an even stronger Hurricane that, again, it's probably not gonna miss, which makes breaking through a lot of the generically specially bulky Pokemon a fair bit easier compared to some of its competition. Now, of course, you could still run Terra Ground on this too. As we've talked about, that's just a generally really solid option. But I think for lead Venomoth, not Venomoth, Vivillon, you don't want to bust your Terra out if you don't have to, and as a result, it's generally just better to have it as a Terra option that you come into battle thinking, okay, at most I'm using it to wall break. And then, of course, Lilligant follows suit. Now, I think Lilligant's pretty scary for a number of options. Naturally, number one, it has Sleep Powder, and the combination of Sleep Powder and Quiver Dance is just always scary, but also, it has a lot of options for what it could Terra into. You see here, I've got Terra Ice, because that would help with Goodra, but I think you could also go with Terra Fire, because that's going to help against the Steel types. That's going to help against other Grass types as well, if you just want to have that option. Terra Ice is like very specialized towards Goodra, whereas Terra Fire, Steel types, while also hitting Grass types. And then Terra Ground probably is a fine option too to hit Fire types in addition to Steel types still. Also not listed here, if you want better longevity and more power, you could go with a Life Orb as your item, and then go with Giga Drain instead of Petal Dance. And then, of course, last in the maybe bans is Oricorio, the Bale form, because at the end of the day, Fire Flying, you remember Moltres, it's pretty good defensive typing. And although, of course, the knockoff weakness is even more crippling compared to Pom Pom, since, I mean, you have to Terra if you don't want to take half from Stealth Rock. If you ever switch into a knockoff, there's still a lot of nice things about Fire Flying. You, of course, still have that CC resist, you still have that immunity to ground. So you set up safely versus a lot of the same things that Oricorio Pom Pom does. It's just, knockoff is a lot more punishing. So, maybe Oricorio Bale would be OP as well, but it's hard to say. And then we get to the last two down here, which I didn't title this one, but originally it was titled like "Don't?" question mark Ban Quiver Dance. And it's because these ones just haven't seen a lot of use. So, the jury's still out on this. In theory, Masquerain could bring back this old lead set from Sun and Moon Inu. to maybe some good success, maybe even just run Substitute instead of Sticky Web. Intimidate still lets you do a lot of the same stuff as Pom Pom, but it's hard to say. Because again, we haven't seen it. And in Oricorio Pow, we've just not seen any of it all. But, again, it's sort of like Oricorio Bale in that compared to Pom Pom, knockoff is a huge issue for it. You can't really switch into Passimian as safely as you'd like to. And so maybe that would keep it contained. It's just, it's not as good as a fighting type situational switching compared to Pom Pom and even Sensu. Because at least with Sensu, yeah, I mean, you also take super effective damage from knockoff, but I find that you're more likely to Terra, at least, into a type that resists Dark. Whereas with a lot of the other Oricorios, you probably want Ground, just for general utility slash coverage. Again, Flying Psychic, that is wholly resisted by Steel. Maybe you want a Terra Ground so you can beat a Steel type. Fire Flying, you're weak to a Rock. You're also incredibly weak to Stealth Rock, so gaining a resistance to that is a lot better. And with Pom Pom, we addressed that earlier. It's mainly just there so that you can get rid of that Stealth Rock weakness, and so that you can also have coverage for, a couple of the just generic, specially bulky Pokemon like Muck, like Terra Poison Guja, for example. But I hope you all enjoyed this, shorter end type of video, just covering all the Quiver Dancers. I also want to just show, real quick, how Terastallization can play into this. Because as you can see in this video here, our protagonist, Davo, is going to switch in their Passimian, which should normally revenge kill a Frosmoth, as it Quiver Dances, with Terra Fighting CC. But because he Terra'd into a Fairy type, and is also a bulkier Frosmoth than normal, he takes this with ease, not even being 2-hit KO'd potentially by the Passimian CC. So that's just something to think about too, with how Terra allots even some of these other Quiver Dance users a whole bunch of safe chances to set up. Until next time though, guys, I hope y'all having a lovely day. I'll catch you then. Peace.